It's been 2 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action. The intention is to get everyone, from policymakers to just regular citizens, to reconcile the damage done by residential schools. Marie Wilson is one of the people tasked with follow-through on these calls to action. She was a commissioner with the TRC, and she's in Regina today to speak at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon. She joins me now in studio. Good morning.
Good morning, Sheila.
What's your message today at this luncheon?
Well, I have found over the course of the past year and a half since the commission officially wrapped up that what I have to share is always a bit of backing up and going forward at the same time, because there is still a huge task of ongoing work of educating people. There are still many, many people in this country that don't even know that we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that don't understand that it was not implemented by government, but rather by the survivors themselves, that it was a bold, courageous action by the survivors of the residential schools and paid for from their court proceedings. That there is something in there that is for everyone to do, and it's not just the government has a big to-do list. So there's always important contextualizing to happen so that people understand, why are we even talking about this?
Does that frustrate you to a certain degree that, there's been so much attention paid in the media and all of that to the work of the TRC? Are you frustrated when you run across people who really still don't get it?
I'm not frustrated so much when people don't know about it. When people learn and resist and try to turn it into something other than it was, that becomes frustrating.
How do you mean? How do you mean?
Well, if you have people who still say, well, it couldn't have been that bad, or it was all back then, or why don't they get over it, those sorts of glib comments that are not well informed. Well, Senator Bayak is an interesting example. Because, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was unique in many ways in the world, but it certainly was not the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we know from our world history that you don't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when everything is going well. That's not why you have one. You have one because something terribly wrong has happened, which is not to say that good and kind and indeed beautiful things may not have also occurred in the context of that. But that's not the clarion call that says we need to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to get to the bottom of this. So I think it's a really skewed focus, and the work at hand is the work that needs to be done. And I think that honoring what the survivors told us and the lessons they taught us, it is an investment in our own education as a country. To pay attention, because most of us didn't grow up knowing these things. And it's ongoing work. So to come back to your point, I try really hard to take people where they're at, to bring a sense of belief in the goodness of people, that once people do know, they will respond in positive ways. And we still do get many people saying, I had no idea, and that is not right.
How are we doing on the calls to action, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not, as an individual, in a position to have the broad overview of everything that's going on. But what I can tell you, since the commission officially wrapped up in December of 2015, today, in fact, just a few days ago, was the 2-year anniversary of our summary report and the calls to action. Our final report was 6 months later. And I have not stopped. The interest has remained high, and it's because people are asking themselves the deep questions of, what does this mean to us? What might we do? Here's what we are doing. Is there more that we can do? And while I don't have the answers to that, I think what I can do is share the lessons from the commission, which was the things that I think we got right about how to create space and how to make it possible for people who had never sat in the same rooms before to come together and to begin to know each other as neighbors, as potential collaborators, and for some as new friends. And that's where change becomes really possible.
Can you give some examples of things you've seen?
Well, today's an example. I mean, here I am in Regina. I didn't come here at my own inclination. I was invited because there is an interest among a collaborative community of interest here to say we need to take stock of where we are at with this in this province, in this community, and specifically in the business realm for the Chamber of Commerce conversation, because business touches on all of us. It is what creates wealth and well-being in our communities. And as long as we still have statistics where huge swaths of our population, and in this province very glaringly, are not at the receiving end, are still living in exceptional degrees of poverty, then there's still work to do. So I think it's great that there is an opening to conversation and that there's a growing opening for new voices to be engaged in that conversation, because that will guarantee that new ideas come forward and that new possibilities are expressed. I think one thing that's really important is in the 94 calls to action, and by the way, for listeners, not 94 pages, about a dozen pages, and I think compelling reading for everyone of reading age in this country, and certainly every adult, to read those 94 calls to action, because they're not all about what the government should do. There are things in there about what individuals can contribute to through their professional lives, through their personal lives.
Well, journalists was where I first heard from you.
Well,
you were speaking at a gathering of journalists dealing with specifically the calls to action for the media. There really is something for every part of society.
And, we talked about people say, well, what does reconciliation mean? It doesn't mean one thing. It means many things. But what it means, I think, in a colossal sense, is change. And so we have to, if we all just keep doing everything we've always done in the same old ways we've always done them, that change will not happen. And so we need to have conversations at a local and community level and within our organizations and professional associations to say, what might we do differently? What might we do new?
And they're practical.
Yeah. But they're not prescribed. Ours are not prescribed. They're generic. And then it's for those who are taking it on, say in the context of Regina, say in the context of CBC Regina, or in the context of the Chamber of Commerce, to say, what might that mean to us? So an example would be hiring practices. We have ourselves enslaved to hiring practices that say qualifications mean this and this and this academic achievement. We heard from thousands of survivors who may not have those academic qualifications, but they have qualities of resiliency, of survivorship, of creativity, of endurance, of strength of character that are sometimes the golden qualities in great employees that don't necessarily come from paper qualifications. So can we free ourselves up, for example, when we look at a clause like other related experiences and get new people in the doors, so we're not continuing to be organizations inside talking about people who are outside.
How do you imagine Canada in 20 years? When you look at these calls to action playing out, maybe all being, in an optimistic way of looking at things, all being implemented, what do you imagine that Canada will look like 20 years after this?
Yeah. So it's interesting. In next week, I believe it is, there's a gathering in Ottawa called Imagine a Canada, and it's bringing young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, together to explore that very question. But I've spoken about this for myself. And I've had a very rich life, Sheila. I've been blessed with living in many parts of Canada, but also many parts of the world. And so our international nature I see as a great wealth and a great richness. But I would imagine a Canada, this is me speaking, where we would stop saying we are a country of immigrants, where we would begin proudly to say we are an Indigenous country with a beautiful Indigenous name, Kanata, to which people from all over the world have been welcomed over the past few centuries, and that we would recognize with pride, rather than as a problem to be solved, the fact that we are on the homelands of some of the oldest peoples on the planet, and that we would feel enriched and blessed by that, and that we would all find ways to hold each other up in a good way.
Marie, thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.